you are 9 years old. You do not remember your mother's voice anymore. Only the waves. Only the smell of salt and blood. Your legs are bound at the ankles with rope made from coconut husk. You tried to fight them once, but they broke your arm in 3 places. Now it dangles uselessly beside you as the dhow sways with the morning tide. The sun has barely risen, but the wooden deck is already slick with urine and vomit. A dozen other boys, all your age or younger, lie silent in their own filth. Some are dead. The others wish they were. You've been told that you are going to be cleansed, that you will be reborn in the house of a nobleman. But you know what happened to the last boy they dragged below deck? He screamed until the screaming stopped. Now it is your turn. The Arab sailor motions toward the hatch. You cannot walk, but they carry you anyway. Down into the dark. Down where the blood never dries. You will not come back up the same. If you come back up at all. For centuries, this was not considered cruelty. It was commerce. Between the 9th and 19th centuries, Arab and Persian traders operated one of the most profitable and least documented slave routes in human history across the Indian Ocean. Unlike the transatlantic trade, this one left behind fewer chains, fewer ship logs, and fewer monuments, but it destroyed just as many lives. At the heart of it were boys, African boys, taken from villages along the Swahili coast, modern-day Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique. They were captured or sold, then castrated and trafficked as eunuchs to serve in the harems and royal courts of Arabia, Persia, and sometimes even India and China. Many died during the operation. That was expected. It was said that only the strongest survived. But what survived was rarely a child anymore. What you're about to hear is not rumor. It is not myth. It is drawn from Arab merchant logs, East African oral histories, and the few colonial records that dared document what local rulers preferred to forget. This is the story of the Indian Ocean castration trade, and the boys whose screams were swallowed by the sea, the empire without a name. The Indian Ocean slave trade had no flag, no single king, no single capital. It was not dictated by a crown, but by the wind. From the 9th century onward, the monsoon currents dictated more than the weather. They shaped a complex lattice of maritime commerce, stretching from the Swahili coast to Oman, Basra, Hormuz, and as far as the Mughal ports of Gujarat, and where spices and ivory moved. Sodded people. But unlike the Atlantic slave trade, brutal and bureaucratic, this trade was older, softer in its footprint, and harder to trace. It operated in silence, woven into the pulse of Islamic trade law, religious custom, and the blurred lines of coastal kingdoms where sovereignty was negotiated rather than declared. The Swahili coast, a chain of city-states like Kilwa, Mombasa, Pate, and Zanzibar became the supply hub. Here, African rulers exchanged boys for cloth, sugar, and swords. The Arab traders did not need to capture children themselves. They paid others to do it. At the markets of Bagamoyo and Zanzibar, buyers examined boys like livestock. Teeth were inspected. Genitals were measured. Some were fiatain. Many were younger. The destination was often Mecca, Medina, or Muscat. Not the fields, but the palaces. Not toil, but service. The goal was not to break them through labor. It was to remake them through mutilation. Religion gave the system its mask. Islamic law forbade the castration of slaves, but it did not forbid owning eunuchs. So the procedure was outsourced. Boys were shipped to port cities like Massawa or Suakin, where unofficial cutters performed the operation, often without training. The entire genitalia, not just the testes, were removed. The wound was packed with ash. If the child did not bleed to death, he was deemed fit for export. Some were sold into royal harems, as guards or attendants. Some were gifted to powerful men as exotic symbols of status. They were prized for their silence, their supposed lack of desire, their supposed obedience. But nothing about this system was silent. In 1840, the Sultan of Oman moved his capital to Zanzibar, an island built on the blood of boys. By the mid-19th century, more than 50,000 slaves were passing through the island annually. Many were children. Many were castrated. European missionaries recorded their horror, but they were outnumbered, and their voices faded into the margins of colonial reports. The British eventually outlawed the practice on paper, but by then, centuries had passed. Entire generations had vanished into the sea. This trade did not rely on conquest. It relied on consent, not from the children, but from the fathers who sold them, the sultans who taxed them, the merchants who counted profit by the number of boys who survived the blade. The Indian Ocean was calm, serene, blue, It betrayed no signs of what had passed across its surface. But the trauma lingered not in archives, not in museums, but in the whispered stories of elders, from coastal Kenya to Oman. Stories that speak of boys who returned as men, but never spoke again. If they returned at all, the boys of Mtwara. They came at night. No torches. No warning. Only the soft thud of bare feet through millet fields, and the hush of blades drawn from leather sheaths. By the time the roosters cried, the village was ash. This was southern Tanganyika, today's Mtwara region. In the 18th century, it was the heartland of the Yao people. Fishermen, rainmakers, mothers who painted their sons with ochre to keep evil away. But ochre could not stop what was coming. The boy's name was Buana. He was 8. They found him hiding beneath a collapsed cooking hut, clinging to his younger brother's corpse. His mother had been taken perhaps to the inland markets of Nyasa. He would not see her again. Buana was tied to a caravan of 15 boys. They walked for 5 days without shoes. 3 died on the second day. Their bodies were left in the brush. No prayers. No markers. Just silence. They reached Kilwa in early summer. There was no cage. No auctioneer shouting bids. Just a low thatched stall by the mangroves, where Arab traders sat cross-legged, eating dried dates and pointing casually at boys as if selecting fruit. The older ones 10, 11 featured higher prices. Not because they were stronger, but because they were more likely to survive what came next. Buana was considered a risk. Small, quiet, fragile, but his eyes were light brown, unusual for the region. A trader from Muscat bought him for 7 yards of cotton and a handful of silver dirhams. They called it a good deal. The cutter worked out of a back room in Pemba. His name was not recorded. The procedure was simple. A short blade, a boiling cloth, ash from the fire pit, no sedation, no priest, no father holding the child's hand. Buana did not scream. He fainted. That was easier for them. 2 boys died that week from infection. 1 bled out in his sleep. The cutter charged half price for their bodies. They were sold to pearl divers in Oman, who needed children small enough to fit between the coral gaps. Buana lived, but he never ran again. The muscles in his legs atrophied from the fever. He could walk, but he walked like someone older, slower, watching his step as if the earth might give way. They put him on a dhow, bound for Basra. In Basra, he was renamed Karim. He wore silks. He poured rosewater for his master's guests. He was taught to bow at the door and never look a woman in the eye. He was told that his service was honorable, that the Prophet had favored the loyalty of eunuchs. But Karim remembered fire, remembered blood, remembered the smell of burnt flesh and the laughter of men who did not speak his language. He served until he was 23. When his master died, Karim was transferred to a cousin's household. That cousin gave him to a merchant's wife as a birthday gift. She liked the way he braided her hair. No one ever asked if he wanted to stay. No one asked if he could still feel pain. By the time Karim was 40, he stopped speaking altogether. They said he had grown wise with age, that his silence was the mark of a faithful servant. He died in a back room in Shiraz. Beneath a wall of Persian poetry he could not read. They buried him without a name. Just a marker. Just a date. The household mourned him for 1 afternoon. Then the merchant bought another boy. And the cycle began again. Buana's story is not extraordinary. It is not unique. It is typical. Tens of thousands of boys from the inland regions of East Africa were taken, cut, shipped, renamed, and erased. Their childhoods disappeared into the fog of euphemism. Purified, initiated, trained. They were not trained. They were mutilated. They were not honored. They were used. And for many, the greatest cruelty was that they were expected to smile while it happened. The machinery of flesh. No slave ship crossed the Indian Ocean without calculation. The wind was timed. The water was measured. And the lives on board were catalogued by weight, age, and likelihood of survival. This was not chaos. It was choreography. And at the center of it stood the Swahili middlemen, fluent in Arabic, fluent in Bantu, and fluent in the currency of silence. The trade depended on a delicate partnership. Local African rulers, especially in the Yao, Makua, and Nyamwezi regions, were incentivized to raid neighboring tribes. Boys under the age of 12 were preferred. Easier to tame, easier to cut. Captured children were sold to coastal traders, who operated stalls in Kilwa, Lamu, Zanzibar, and Pemba. These city-states had long histories of Islamic scholarship and mercantile wealth, but behind the mosques and coral stone palaces, another economy pulsed, one made of limbs and blood. The coastal Arabs did not castrate boys themselves. That would violate Islamic law. Instead, They outsourced it to freelance cutters, often of African origin, operating in hidden compounds along the coast. These men were paid per procedure. They used no medical instruments, no anesthesia, just a knife, fire ash, and hours of prayer that the boy would survive. Survival was rare. Estimates suggest that only 1 in 10 boys survived full castration, the removal of both penis and testicles. The rest died of shock, hemorrhage, or infection, but that was acceptable, because a surviving eunuch was worth 20 times more on the market than an uncut boy. The risk was part of the cost. The cutters were paid in advance. If the boy died, his body was dumped in the mangroves, or sold to pearl divers, who had use for small, limber corpses. New questions asked. The survivors were called Kasi castrated ones. In Persian, they became Gilman. In Swahili, they were simply called Watamwa the owned. They were transported aboard DO ships bound for Muscat, Basra, Hormuz, and Mecca. Some reached as far as Hyderabad, Malacca, or the Chinese coast. Those who reached Mecca often served in the holy sanctuaries. The irony was bitter. The mutilated boys forced to clean the floor beneath the feet of pilgrims seeking purity. Others were assigned to harems as guards, where they were trusted to oversee hundreds of concubines, precisely because they were presumed harmless, neutered, voiceless, loyal. In the Ottoman Empire, such eunuchs wielded real power. In the Indian Ocean trade, they wielded none. The buyers were not always kings. Wealthy merchants, minor nobles, and religious leaders all sought eunuchs as symbols of refinement. A well-trained castrated boy was proof of status like silk, or saffron, or gold. He was decoration, servant, property. The practice persisted for centuries, because it was profitable, but also because it was palatable. The system masked its violence behind language. Boys were not mutilated. They were purified. They were not silenced. They were disciplined. They were not destroyed. They were reborn. Every link in the chain had a rationale. Religious leaders cited hadiths about loyal eunuchs. Coastal rulers justified the sales as tribute. Arab merchants framed the trade as civilizing, giving African boys access to faith, literacy, and structure. But literacy, without agency, is decoration, and faith without consent is tyranny. Even European colonists, when they arrived, did not end the system immediately. The Portuguese, and later, the British, used it. Missionary accounts from the mid-1800 seconds describe boys found bleeding in coral huts, their legs bound in banana leaves. But the missionaries were few, their influence limited. The British banned slave trading in Zanzibar in 1873, but underground operations persisted well into the early 20th century. It is not enough to say the system was hidden. It was designed to be hidden, in plain sight, through legal loopholes, religious exemptions, economic necessity, through a silence so deep, it passed for obedience, the memory of mutilation. You do not inherit a scar, but you can inherit its silence. For the Swahili coast, the legacy of the castration trade was not just physical, it was generational. In villages from Tonga to Nampula, entire lineages disappeared. Boys who were taken, renamed, and stripped of the ability to reproduce. Communities lost sons, tribes lost heirs, and the stories, the songs, the lineage names, they vanished with them. This was not just mutilation of bodies, it was mutilation of memory. The survivors rarely returned. Most eunuchs died in foreign cities, buried beneath unfamiliar scripts, under names they did not choose. But in rare cases, a boy might live into old age and find his way back to Kilwa, to Lamu, to Mtwara. They returned with ornate robes and fluent Arabic, but they were not received as heroes. They were marked, not by visible scars those had healed, but by something deeper, a softness in their voice, a strangeness in their gait, an emptiness behind the eyes that made neighbors uneasy. They had no wives, no children, no clan to return to. Some were given food, others were turned away. Most were forgotten before they died. But the cycle continued not through the survivors, but through the silence they left behind. Fathers still sold sons during drought years. Village chiefs still struck deals with Arab merchants. The cutters still waited in the shadows of the coast. Each generation watched the one before it do nothing, so they did nothing, too. And so, the mutilation ritual became invisible, not because it was hidden, but because it was known, and ignored. Even after abolition laws, the trade adapted. Boys were renamed as domestic apprentices. The cut was called a surgical correction, The dhow became a steamship. The buyer wore a European coat, but the blade was the same. Culture does not erase trauma. It absorbs it. Among the Swahili, older folk tales carry quiet warnings of boys who vanished into the sea and returned with no voice, of shadows in the mangrove, swamps that cut without killing, of men who speak perfect Arabic but weep when it rains. They are not called eunuchs. They are not called anything, because to name them would be to remember, and to remember would be to confront what was done. Génération passed. Names changed, borders shifted, but the patterns remained. Even today, there are families along the Tanzanian coast who refuse to speak of certain great uncles, who burn letters sent from Muscat, who keep old silver coins buried beneath kitchen stones. They are not preserving history. They are burying it, because the cycle of this trade was never just about mutilating boys. It was about teaching communities to accept that mutilation as normal. And once you teach people that, you do not need chains anymore. They will bind themselves with silence, the forgotten bloodline. You walk through the spice markets of Zanzibar today, and there is no trace, no statues, no plaque, no museums, only cinnamon, cardamom, nutmeg, and silence. It is not that the island has forgotten, it is that it has never been allowed to remember. The Indian Ocean castration trade was not just a tragedy of bodies, it was a tragedy of historical erasure. Unlike the transatlantic slave trade with its ships, erasure, its mass documentation, this trade was quieter. Its records were oral. Its victims were renamed. Its scars were internal. The boys who were taken left no descendants, no sons to remember them, no daughters to sing their names. They were erased twice, once in the body, once in the archive. Yet their absence shaped empires. In Arabia, castrated African boys became essential cogs in royal courts, serving as harem guards, palace servants, trusted intermediaries, even as executioners. Their value was paradoxical, utterly disposable, yet constantly desired. Their obedience was enforced through biology, their loyalty presumed because they had been stripped of all other ties. In East Africa, their disappearance created a vacuum. Generations of Swahili men grew up without brothers, without cousins, without a future that bore their names. Villages that once had 20 households dwindled to 3. Lineages that had thrived for centuries ended in a single raid. This was not collateral damage. It was design. Colonial powers saw the wounds, but they used them. British and German administrators often exploited local divisions caused by the slave trade, weaponizing silence, rewarding compliance, and allowing the legacy of trauma to serve as a buffer between native populations and colonial rule. And when abolition came, it was framed not as restitution, but as moral superiority. European narratives emphasized their role in ending the trade, while minimizing the scale of African suffering. The castrated boys became footnotes in their own history, pitied in missionary journals, ignored in textbooks, and dismissed as curiosities in the margins of imperial reports. The consequences extend beyond borders. Even today, the topic remains taboo across much of the Muslim world and the Swahili coast. To speak of it is to accuse ancestors, to confront holy cities, to stain lineages with truths no one wants to inherit. So the silence continues. But silence is not the same as peace. To ignore a wound is not to heal it, and the memory of those boys, the tens of thousands whose bodies were altered, whose names were stolen, whose futures were severed, deserves more than footnotes. It deserves confrontation, reflection, remembrance, not for guilt, not for shame, but because history, when told fully, has the power to restore what was stolen, not lives, but dignity. You do not remember their names, but they remembered each other. In the darkness of the dhow, in the pain that did not end, in the silence that spoke volumes, and now you have heard it, too.